This episode, and others like it, are made possible by the generous support of my patrons on Patreon. In some other news, I recently started a podcast with Hakeem and Yugopnik. It's called The Deprogram, and it's a show dedicated to helping listeners shake off the capitalist programming we've all been subjected to over the years. We tackle all sorts of topics, from theory to current events to culture, and just generally have a good time. If that sounds like something you'd enjoy, be sure to check it out by following any of the links below. The truth isn't always in the middle. Sometimes you have to pick a side. This week, we're talking about having left-wing political beliefs. Now, this might sound like we're running out of topics. Let's begin. Oftentimes, it can feel like having a strong, ideological, and staunchly left-wing political opinion is seen as an inherently bad thing, especially according to liberal politicians. Biden, for example, can almost always be found muttering about healing the nation, reaching across the aisle, combating polarization, or not ceding to the extremes. Extremes there with an S at the end. If Democrats lost the latest election, it is always because they didn't listen or talk to the undecided voters in the center enough. And if they won, well, now it's time to reach across the aisle and do politics the right way by hearing the other side out. The way to go is always to push a little more towards the right and be a little more amenable to conservative discourse. Endless twists on these same slogans have been presented to us by liberal politicians for years, with the barely hidden assumption that it's simply the more grown-up, reasonable thing to do to have this kind of pragmatic approach to politics, to seek compromise above ideological commitment, to play the game of democracy, quote, the right way. Having opinions that are irreconcilable with the opposition is just being childish. The mature thing to do is sit down and talk and figure out a way to coexist, no matter what the other side says. And this makes sense when you understand how liberals think of politics in general. Liberals tend to understand politics as the debate of ideas. The motor of the political history car, for liberal thinkers and politicians, has long been idealism, successive debates on the nature of what is good and just. Whereas Marxists view the movement of politics through the lens of power distribution and materialism, liberals tend to believe that it is through reason and argumentation that ideas appear and enter into political conflict, and those that are right triumph, and those that are wrong fail to shape the world. The good always wins over the bad, and reason always comes out on top, if only in the long run. It can't go any other way because what determines what is good is the outcome of debate. Politics is therefore about who has the better arguments. And in our neoliberal society, so heavily steeped in business juice, this is sometimes referred to as the marketplace of ideas thesis. It's a bit of a generalization, but for liberals, this is what politics is at its core. The debate of ideas. And it's a really attractive concept. But it doesn't always work like they expect it to. Like right now, for example. Bad ideas have been winning recently. Fascist, nationalist, and identitarian politics have been on the rise for years at this point throughout the liberal world. And it's not just ideas. Hate crimes too. Femicides, the killing of members of the LGBT community, anti-Semitism, the murder of Black and Asian Americans, all of them are trending upwards. Bad ideas are gaining political ground in the marketplace, and the results aren't good. And there's a reason for that. It's not that suddenly fascist arguments were reworded in the perfect way, slipping into the unsuspecting minds of millions of conservatives in a feat of rhetorical trickery. Neither is it the case that conservatives are just dumb. No, it's because politics isn't all about ideas. In other words, ideas and their success are not just a matter of argumentation. They are heavily conditioned by material circumstances. It's our current socio-political and economic context that gives fascist rhetoric a foothold and the means to be developed. Let me be more specific. What the neoliberal era has produced, which is to say massive inequality, the death of the welfare state compromise, and perpetual war, has been seized upon by fascist rhetoric, where socialists can explain this general worsening of conditions for all but an extremely wealthy minority through an analysis of systems and institutions. Fascists hijack these explanations and transform them by blaming what's wrong with the world not on systems, but on the existence of the wrong kind of people, thereby protecting existing institutions. And it works. The best predictor of whether someone voted for Trump in 2016 was racial resentment. And that's at least partly because plenty of people are happy to make sure it stays that way. The reason that Tucker Carlson has the most watched show in America and there are no leftists on major television networks isn't because he has the best ideas, but because he has the ideas that Fox's billionaire owner is willing to pay for. No billionaire wants to fund an anti-capitalist pundit, but plenty are willing to pay for the guy who will say that white people are being replaced when viewers ask what's wrong with this country. And this is frustrating, because what do liberals do about this state of affairs? Well, first, they usually refuse to recognize that a system of private ownership of media institutions creates these consequences. They refuse to acknowledge that capitalist-owned media obviously promotes pro-capitalist politics, and in times of acute trouble, has a tendency to scapegoat capitalism's problems by blaming them on black people, Asian people, immigrants, trans people, Jewish people, or really anyone whose identity is immutable and easy to victimize. Liberals don't like talking about media ownership like this, at least not so directly or in such terms, because acknowledging it would mean admitting that having the best argument isn't always enough. Liberals prefer to believe that the political system is value neutral, and that any idea, like any business, can thrive in the marketplace on merit alone. But once again, like in business, that's simply not true. The socio-political capitalist system is not neutral to the arguments that inhabit it. Some arguments will win not on their merit, but on their ability to conform with the system and its actors. In practice, some ideas won't get broadcast very much or will get outright censored, some will be able to roam freely, and some will get a boost. It's just not enough to simply send ideas out there, mainly because there are better funded ideas out there waiting in the shadows to beat the shit out of them. And it probably doesn't help that at the end of the day, Democrats need money too. To get election funding, you need billionaires just like the conservatives do. Rejecting capitalism makes it really hard to get on TV stations owned by capitalists on favorable terms, harder to advertise yourself, and therefore harder to win. So what do Democrats do instead if they can't or are unwilling to criticize the conditions in which ideological debate happens? What do they do since they assume that the conditions are mostly fair for everyone because there's no one actively censoring the public debate? Well, they'll blame the extremes for getting things out of whack, find comfort in the idea that, given due time, things will eventually resolve when the arc of history bends towards justice, and double down by insisting that we must hear both sides. Liberals cling to the idea that even though this process of idealistic debate, whether in privately owned media or in government, was not meant to work for the realization of justice, but to preserve the hierarchical order that benefited its founders, that it is still immoral to work outside of it, and equally so from the left or the right. Liberals are desperate for a political process that can work in all circumstances, that can be perfectly neutral in the way it gives space for divergent ideas and can totally abstract the stark power imbalances of the real world through reason alone. But it can't. And simultaneously, they refuse to challenge the capitalist economic system that builds those very same power imbalances into reality. What we're left with is a call to hear both sides in a world that will heavily cater to one side. The side that is prepared to dispose of everyone outside an ever-shrinking in-group before admitting that there might be something wrong with our current economic model. In more concrete terms, it looks like this. Every year between 2003 and 2010, climate change denial organizations had an income over $900 million. $900 million that they could spend on spreading disinformation. Almost $1 billion to set the terms of what one of the two sides would be. On TV, it meant having a climate change denier pitted against a climate scientist, with the implication that the two sides of the debate were equally worthy of consideration, and that the audience could make up their minds between two mostly evenly matched arguments. When there is a dogmatic commitment to hear both sides, but no analytical model to understand how both sides form, this is what you get. A model of public debate where one side can pay to set the terms of the conversation, and in the process, artificially delay a public decision in their favor. Fossil fuel companies paid for the debate to be between climate change's existence and climate change being a farce. And it won them enough time to shift the debate to where it is today, where climate change is now broadly acknowledged, but now we debate how quickly we really want to adapt, once again buying them more time. Time itself is a tool in a bad faith debater's hand. So long as we continue debating on these terms and delay the moment where we commit to a decision, the current state of affairs continues uninterrupted. But we don't have to treat ideas like these, ideas that are more compatible with the capitalist system, as equal to ideas that are more compatible with our values of justice. We know that putting a climate denier on equal footing with a climate scientist on TV is not objectivity. The two positions are not equivalent. One is obviously wrong, and it is okay, in fact it is the moral imperative, to treat these two positions with imbalance. Then we know about things like the paradox of intolerance. A society that tolerates intolerance runs the risk of, should the circumstances prove favorable, losing out to intolerance. It is okay to be committed to tolerance and, in an effort to protect it, therefore to limit the spread of intolerant ideas. So, while it is important to listen to different perspectives, there is nothing wrong with determining one of them to be more correct or more valid than the other. That's the ultimate goal of reflection and scientific inquiry. Having convictions doesn't make you an extremist. It doesn't make you unreasonable or not pragmatic. It makes you a human being who's willing to stand up for what you believe is right rather than let bad ideas have free rein. There are times when two people can disagree and both have valid points. But there are also times when one narrative should be dismissed outright. Not every idea is a good one. Do your research, adjust your perspectives based on new evidence, and don't be afraid to pick a side. Sometimes it's the right thing to do. I'll end on an MLK quote from his letter from Birmingham jail, because, let's be honest, it's easy points. See you next week.
First, I must confess that over the past few years I have been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in his stride toward freedom is not the white citizens' counselor or the Ku Klux Klaner, but the white moderate who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action, who paternalistically believes he can set the timetable for another man's freedom, who lives by a mythical concept of time, and who constantly advises the Negro to wait for a more convenient season. Shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. Lukewarm acceptance is much more bewildering than outright rejection. I had hoped that the white moderate would understand that law and order exist for the purpose of establishing justice, and that when they fail in this purpose, they become the dangerously structured dams that block the flow to social progress. I had hoped that white moderates would understand.
I mentioned at the beginning of this video that this kind of content is made possible by my patrons on Patreon. Thanks to viewers like you, I've not only been able to keep up my weekly videos, but also start a new podcast with two other great YouTubers. Hakeem Ugopnik and I started the Deprogram because there was a real lack of a truly international socialist podcast. And what better way to fix that than having three socialists from three different parts of the world come together to discuss our unique perspectives on important topics. That, and it's just fun to hang out and talk commie stuff for an hour or so each week. If you'd like to help support the podcast, join our Discord, and get early access to every episode, consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/thedeprogram. Otherwise, you can catch one episode per week absolutely free on all your favorite podcast platforms or right here on YouTube. So check out the Deprogram by following any of the links below. If you enjoyed this video, consider dropping a like. If you hated it, a thumbs down. You can check out my previous episodes by clicking the links on your screen. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.